The shovel bit into the earth with a sound like a dull tooth breaking. Elias drove it down with the heel of his boot, the worn leather groaning in protest. He leveraged the handle back, lifted the load of damp, dark soil, and tossed it onto the growing mound beside the trench. A few stones rattled down the side. Beside him, the dog Barrow lifted his head from his paws, his intelligent eyes tracking the arc of the soil. He gave a low sigh, a puff of dust rising from the ground around his nose, and settled again, a silent, patient witness to the slow scarring of the meadow. It was the 47th day of digging. The trench was now 7 feet deep in places and stretched 93 feet from the excavated hollow that would one day be a house, running straight as a surveyor's line toward the low rise of the eastern hill. Barrow's ear twitched. A moment later, Elias heard it too, the rhythmic clop of a horse and the jangle of a harness. He paused, leaning on his shovel handle, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-caked hand. Mr. Gable pulled his wagon to a stop on the rough track that passed for a road. He was a man shaped by the seasons, his face a roadmap of winters endured and summers worked, his hands thick and capable on the reins. He nodded once, a gesture that was less a greeting and more an acknowledgement of presence. Elias. Mr. Gable. Gable chewed on a piece of straw, his gaze sweeping over the long, deep wound in the earth, the piles of excavated soil, the neat stacks of fieldstone Elias had been hauling from the creek bed for weeks. Still at it, I see. Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, letting the shovel do the talking. It was his way. His father had been the same. A man of few words and much work. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen, Gable said, finally breaking the silence. It wasn't said with malice, but with the flat certainty of a man who knew how the world worked. What in God's name are you building? A grave for a giant? Elias looked down the length of the trench, seeing not a ditch, but a lung. He could feel the cool, stable breath of the deep earth, a constant 55 degrees, waiting. He had read it 100 times in his father's journals, the spidery script detailing theories of thermal mass and geothermal exchange. Ideas gleaned from old books and older civilizations, dismissed by men like Gable who put their faith only in what they could see and what had been done before. A chimney, Elias said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the open air. Gable took the straw from his mouth and stared. He looked at the trench, then back at Elias, as if trying to reconcile the word with the reality. A chimney? You bury a chimney, son, you bury the fire. You bury the fire, you die. It's the first thing a child learns out here. It'll work, Elias said. It was not a plea or a debate. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the stones he'd stacked. Gable shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity crossing his features. He glanced toward the small, existing cabin where Elias lived with his wife, Anya, and their 2 small children. He could likely hear Leo's shouts as he chased a chicken in the yard. Your father, he had some strange ideas, but he always built a proper hearth. A man with a family to think of. You can't afford experiments. Wait until winter. That's when the truth comes calling. He clucked to his horse, the wagon wheels creaking as they began to turn. Wait until winter. The words hung in the air long after the wagon was gone. Elias watched him go, then turned back to the trench. Barrow nudged a wet nose into his hand, a silent reassurance. Elias gripped the shovel. Winter was coming. That was the whole point. He drove the blade into the earth again, the rhythm of the work a prayer against the coming cold. Dig, lift, toss. The sun beat down, and the pile of earth grew higher. The work consumed the summer. While other men were haying, mending fences, and stocking their woodsheds, Elias was in the ground. He finished the main intake trench, then began another, parallel to the first but shallower, for the exhaust. He spent weeks lining them both with flat stones, creating smooth, stable channels. Anya would bring him his lunch, a pail of cool water and thick sandwiches of bread and salted pork. She never questioned him. She would sit on the edge of the excavation with their daughter, Clara, on her lap, watching him work, her presence a quiet bedrock of faith. She had seen the drawings in the journals, had listened in the evenings as he read his father's theories aloud. She didn't need to understand the physics of it. She understood the steady, unwavering purpose in her husband's hands. Leo, their son, was 5. He saw the project as a grand adventure, a castle being built for a subterranean king. He would scramble down the dirt ramps, his small hands patting the cool stone walls of the trenches, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Is it for the winter trolls, Papa?" he'd ask. "It's to keep the trolls out," Elias would reply, never breaking his rhythm. By late August, the trenches were lined and capped with massive stone lintels he and Anya strained to move into place with levers and rollers. Then came the pipe. Not metal, which his father's notes warned would sweat and corrode, but hundreds of sections of fired clay drainage tile he'd bought with the last of his inheritance. He laid them with painstaking precision inside the stone-lined channels, fitting the bell ends and spigots, sealing each joint with a mortar of clay and sand. 180 feet of buried pipe, 8 feet under the frost line. This was the chimney. It would draw cold winter air down, pull it through the long underground passage where the earth's constant temperature would warm it, and deliver it, preheated, to the hearth in the house he had yet to build. Another pipe would draw smoke and stale air out, using the same principle to prevent a backdraft. The town watched. From a distance, mostly. Mr. Sterling, who owned the lumber mill and half the town besides, would sometimes ride his fine horse out to the edge of Elias's property. He'd sit in his saddle, a man surveying a folly, and shake his head. He saw wasted effort, a man digging when he should be building up. He saw a family that would likely need charity come January. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman whose concern was genuine, stopped Anya in the general store. "My dear," she'd said, her voice low and conspiratorial, her hand resting on Anya's arm. "Is he well? This business with the ground, it isn't natural. A house needs to be in the sun. It needs windows to see the winter coming." "He has a plan," Anya replied, her voice as calm and steady as her husband's. "This is our home." As the aspens on the hills turned a brilliant, trembling gold, the foundation of the house was finally laid. It was not a square set upon the land, but a deep U cut into the south-facing slope of the hill. The walls were stone, 2 feet thick, mortared and solid. Elias worked from dawn until the last light failed, his hands raw, his back a constant dull ache. Barrow lay nearby, his fur now dusted with the gray of stone dust instead of the brown of soil. The north wall was the hill itself, a solid mass of earth that would insulate them from the worst of the winter winds. He built the roof with heavy timbers, leaving a deep overhang, and then he did the last thing that cemented his reputation as the town lunatic. He brought in Mr. Gable with his horse and scoop, and paid him to spend 3 days piling the excavated earth back onto the house, burying it. He packed the soil deep against the east and west walls and spread a thick layer, 2 feet deep, over the roof, planting it with the meadow grasses he had so carefully saved. When it was done, the house was less a structure and more a feature of the landscape. A gentle, grass-covered mound rising from the hillside, with a single, protected southern face of stone and glass. And from a small stone housing near the top of the hill, 2 covered clay pipes pointed toward the sky like the ears of a listening animal. Gable took the payment, his face grim. "I've done what you asked, Elias. I've taken your money. But I feel like I just helped you bury your family alive. When the first heavy snow comes, that roof is going to cave in and crush you all." "The timbers are rated for it," Elias said, looking at the gentle slope of his living roof. "The snow will be another blanket." "God help you," Gable said, and this time it sounded like a prayer. They moved in during the first week of October. The air was crisp, and the geese were flying south in great, noisy chevrons. The inside of the house smelled of green wood, damp earth, and curing plaster. It was one large room, with the hearth at its center. The hearth was a masterpiece of stone and clay, a massive, heat-retaining rocket stove his father had designed, with a heated bench running along one wall. It was connected directly to the underground pipes. On the south side, a wall of carefully placed windows let in the low autumn sun, warming the flagstone floor. The light filled the space, dispelling the feeling of being underground. It felt safe, protected. Leo and Clara loved it instantly. To them, it was a hobbit hole, a den, a secret fortress. They ran their hands along the cool stone walls and curled up on the heated bench even before the first fire was lit. Anya set about making it a home, hanging dried herbs from the beams and placing their few simple pieces of furniture. She stood in the center of the room, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Their 3rd child was due in the spring, and a slow smile spread across her face. "It's quiet in here," she said. The ever-present wind that scoured the valley was just a whisper now. Elias lit the first fire in the hearth that evening. He opened the damper to the intake pipe, and after a moment he could feel it, a slight, cool, but not frigid draft. It wasn't the sharp, biting air from outside. It was air that had traveled 80 feet underground, shedding its harshness, tempered by the deep, patient warmth of the earth. The fire caught easily, drawing smoothly. There was no smoke, no sputtering. It burned clean and hot, and the warmth spread not just from the fire itself, but radiated slowly from the great stone mass of the hearth and the heated bench. That night, they slept deeper than they had in months, cocooned in silence and a gentle, even warmth. Outside, the first frost of the season laid a silver blanket over the world, but inside the earth house, it went unnoticed. For the next 2 months, a fragile peace settled over them. Elias chopped and stacked the last of his firewood. He knew he had less than half the cords his neighbors did, a fact that caused much head-shaking in town. "He's got a hole in the ground and a prayer for heat," Sterling was heard to say at the store. "He'll be begging for wood by Christmas." Elias ignored them. He spent his days reinforcing the animal shelters and banking the last of the dirt around the foundation. He trusted the journals. He trusted the stones. He trusted the earth. The winter came not as a gentle slide, but as a sudden, violent blow. It started in mid-December, a week before Christmas. The sky turned a flat, metallic gray, and the wind began to howl out of the northwest, a physical presence that hammered against the world. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour, then another 10. The old-timers like Gable felt it in their bones. This was not a normal cold snap. This was a blizzard of the old kind, the kind that stories were told about. Inside the earth house, the change was subtle. The wind was a muffled roar somewhere far away. The flagstone floor, which had been warmed by the autumn sun, now slowly radiated its stored heat back into the room. The fire in the hearth burned with an almost placid steadiness, the draft from the underground pipe smooth and consistent. Elias kept it fed with small logs, and the thermal mass of the stove absorbed the heat, turning the entire structure into a gentle radiator. The air was fresh and clean, without the stuffy, oxygen-starved feel of a cabin sealed tight against the cold. By the second day, the snow was coming down so thick it was impossible to see the barn from the house. The temperature, according to the thermometer Elias had nailed by the door, was 20 below zero, and still dropping. He went out only to tend to the animals, the journey a brutal battle against the wind and blinding snow. The cold was a living thing, searing his lungs and turning his beard to a mask of ice in seconds. Each time he returned, stepping back inside the house was like entering another world. The transition was jarring. He would shed his ice-caked outerwear by the door, and within feet, the air was calm and warm. Not hot, not stuffy, but a comfortable, even temperature that felt like a permanent state of early autumn. Anya was kneading bread on the big wooden table. Leo and Clara were on the floor, building a tower of wooden blocks. They were in their bare feet. The image struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. His children, playing comfortably, their bare feet on the warm flagstones, while outside a world-killing blizzard raged. The casual domesticity of the scene was the most profound validation he could have imagined. His father's scribbled notes, his own aching muscles, the town's mockery, it had all led to this simple, impossible, beautiful moment. He sat on the bench, the warmth seeping into his frozen bones, and watched them play. Barrow thumped his tail on the floor beside him. Anya looked up from her dough, her eyes meeting his, and she smiled. No words were needed. On the third day, the temperature dropped to 38 below zero. The wind did not slacken. In the town, it was a state of siege. Houses groaned under the assault. Windows were sheets of thick, opaque frost. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, burning through their precious wood piles at a terrifying rate. The very air seemed to crackle with cold. The first knock on the door came in the late afternoon of the fourth day. It was faint, almost lost in the storm. Elias opened it to a figure so covered in snow and ice it was barely human. It was Mr. Gable. He stumbled inside, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He pulled down the scarf covering his face, his eyebrows and mustache thick with frozen breath. "Elias," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Martha, she's not good. Our fire. We're running out of wood. The house. It won't hold the heat. It's as cold inside as it is out." He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the children playing. He felt the gentle, pervasive warmth. He saw the small, steady fire in the hearth. "How?" he whispered. "We're burning 4 times the wood you are, and our walls are slick with ice." "The earth," Elias said simply, "and the chimney. Go get her. Bring her here." Gable didn't hesitate. He plunged back into the storm and returned 20 minutes later, half carrying his wife. Mrs. Gable was wrapped in every blanket they owned, but she was shivering violently, her lips blue. Anya rushed to her, helping her to the heated bench, wrapping her hands around a warm mug of broth. Mrs. Gable's shivering slowly subsided. She looked around the room, her gaze falling on the barefoot children, a sight so incongruous with the howling apocalypse outside that she began to weep. Not from fear or cold, but from sheer, uncomprehending relief. They were not the last. By nightfall, 2 other families had made the desperate trek to the house on the hill. The Sterling's grand house, with its big, drafty windows, had become an icebox. The mill owner, a man of pride and property, arrived humbled and afraid, his young daughter wrapped in a bearskin coat, her face pinched with cold. Elias welcomed them all. The house absorbed them. The single large room became a sanctuary, filled with the quiet murmur of voices and the sleeping forms of children. There was no sense of crowding, only of shared warmth and safety. The air remained fresh, the temperature steady. Elias added a log to the fire every hour or so, a simple meditative act that powered the entire system. Gable sat on a stool near the hearth, watching Elias. He had not spoken much since he arrived, his mind clearly struggling to process the reality around him. He watched the fire, the way it drew without a hint of smoke. He looked at the walls, dry and warm to the touch. He finally stood up and walked over to where Elias was checking the seal on one of the windows. "I was wrong," Gable said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. "Everything I said, everything I thought, I was a fool." "You didn't know," Elias said. "No, I knew everything," Gable corrected him. "I knew how to build a house. I knew how to survive a winter. My father taught me, and his father taught him. All that knowing, it was just another way of being blind." He looked at the children, his own grandchildren among them now, sleeping safely on the floor. "You listened to something else, and you saved us." The great blizzard lasted for 6 days. When the wind finally died down and the snow stopped, the world was transformed, buried under a sea of white. The silence was absolute. The town was crippled. Several of the outlying cabins were found to be empty, their occupants frozen. The town hall became a shelter for those whose homes were no longer habitable. But the story that traveled through the snowbound community was of the house in the hill, the buried house, the place that had remained an island of warmth and life in the midst of the frozen death. The skeptics became converts. The mockery turned to awe, and then to a desperate desire to understand. In the weeks that followed, as the town dug itself out, a steady stream of visitors made their way to Elias's home. They came not just to thank him, but to learn. Men like Sterling, accustomed to giving orders, now stood humbly in Elias's home, asking questions. Elias, a man of few words, would simply show them. He would take them to the stone housing on the hill, let them feel the shockingly mild air coming from the intake pipe. He would show them the massive stone hearth, explaining how it stored and radiated heat. He would unroll his father's journals on the big wooden table, the pages filled with diagrams and calculations, and share the knowledge freely. That spring, 3 new homes were built in the valley. None of them were traditional cabins. They were all cut into the hillsides, with thick stone walls and living roofs. Elias did not oversee the work, but he was a constant presence, offering advice, helping move a difficult stone, explaining the precise angle needed for a south-facing window. He became not a leader, but a teacher. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could, and now his quiet words were treated as gospel. Years passed, the seasons turned. The house on the hill stood, no longer a strange folly, but the heart of the community. The grasses on its roof grew thick, dotted with wildflowers in the spring. Anya gave birth to their 3rd child, a daughter they named Rose, in the warmth and safety of the earth-sheltered room. Leo and Clara grew up, their childhood defined by the security of those stone walls. They never knew the fear of a winter night that so many of their generation understood. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray, and his steps became slow. He spent most of his days sleeping on the warm flagstones by the hearth, the same spot where he had watched Elias work all those years ago. He was a constant, comforting presence, the silent witness to the entire journey. One autumn evening, when he was 14 years old, he lay his head on Elias's lap as the family sat by the fire. He gave a low, contented sigh, the same sound he had made in the dust of the trench on that first day, and simply went to sleep. He did not wake up. Elias buried him on the hill above the house, under a young aspen tree, marking the spot with a simple, smooth river stone. There was a quiet dignity to his passing, a peaceful end to a loyal life that felt like a blessing. The world outside the valley changed. Railways came and new technologies. But the lessons of the Great Blizzard were woven into the fabric of the town. The earth-sheltered homes, once seen as insane, were now just common sense. The knowledge Elias had shared was passed down, refined, and improved upon. His father's journals, once the private obsession of one man, became a public trust, copied and studied. Elias and Anya aged. Their hair turned the color of winter snow. Their hands, which had built so much, grew gnarled with arthritis. Their children grew up and had children of their own, who played barefoot on the same warm flagstones. Leo, who had once asked about winter trolls, now sat with his own son, explaining the principles of geothermal exchange, pointing to the diagrams in his grandfather's journals. One evening, Elias, now an old man with eyes that had seen more than 70 winters, sat on the heated bench, watching his great-grandchildren sleep near the fire. The house was the same. The warmth was the same. The feeling of profound, quiet safety had never left. Anya sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thin with age. "You built a good home." Elias looked at the sleeping children, at the steady, clean-burning fire. He thought of the long trench, the heavy stones, the mockery in Gable's eyes. He thought of his father's lonely faith, captured in ink on brittle paper. He thought of Barrow, his first and most steadfast believer. It was more than a home. It was a promise kept. "We did," he said, his hand finding hers. Elias died peacefully in his sleep a few years later, in the same bed, in the same warm, quiet room. The entire town, and people from settlements miles around, came to pay their respects. They buried him on the hill next to Barrow, overlooking the house. Mr. Gable's son, himself now an old man, carved the headstone. It didn't list his date of birth or death. It said only, "Elias. He listened to the earth and taught us how to live." Decades later, long after the names of the people who had mocked him were forgotten, the house remained. It had become a landmark, a testament. New houses, built with newer methods, rose in the valley, but the original earth house was maintained and preserved, a living piece of history. Travelers would come to see it, to feel the impossible warmth inside on a cold day, to touch the stone walls and run their hands through the wild grasses on the roof. They would stand on the hill by the two simple graves and look out over a valley that had learned a profound lesson about wisdom, persistence, and the quiet strength of a man who was willing to build something different. The wind still blew, and the winters still came, fierce and unforgiving. But in the valley, they were no longer a terror. They were just a season. The buried chimney, once a mark of insanity, had become the symbol of their survival, its gentle, warm breath a constant, quiet legacy.